Welcome to episode 98 of the Lowdown Radio Show presented by eBay Motors. I'm Neil Graham. This week, my guest is Motorcycle Global's Michael Uhlarik. For his industry clients, Michael has exhaustively researched the marketplace, and he shares some of his findings with us. Most startlingly of all, perhaps, are his findings about the invisible 10% of sales that don't show up on any official Motorcycle Industry Council ledger. Michael also shares some of his thoughts about the ADV marketplace. Hint, we may have passed the peak. And we end with a review of Harley-Davidson's financials. And for once, Harley isn't blaming market headwinds for its woes. Well, that's news right there. And stick around. At the end of the show, where I'll review an online riding course that will give you a better chance of being around next year at this time. But first, this message from eBay. The worst part about loving cars might just be buying them and all the parts. From Toyotas to Aston Martins, eBay has thousands of cars and the largest online selection of vehicle parts and accessories. eBay, things people love. We tend to talk about boomers a lot in motorcycling, those who are leaving motorcycling. What we don't tend to talk about is those who are coming to motorcycling. We seem to be fixated on what's gone. And of course, a lot of that, I think, is because a lot of people that write about motorcycling and a lot of people who participated, there they are, that generation. So, when you're dying, you get interested in yourself. But Gen Z, which is roughly 1997 and onward for the next however many years, essentially people who are now, traditionally would be interested in motorcycling. They're not showing up in the numbers, and you've got a theory behind that.
Yeah, so my consultancy, Motorcycle Global, just completed a very intense research report on the low power electric off-road motorcycle market in the US. So think Suron, Light B, or Talaria, those type of vehicles. Because those figures, those numbers behind those vehicles are not reflected in the regular reporting data from the US, from the Motorcycle Industry Council, because they're not a member. Also, they're not sold through traditional dealerships or dealerships at all. In many cases, this type of vehicle are drop shipped through Amazon or other online portals. And so what I did was I had to comb through container manifests, shipping container manifests from China to US West Coast ports. I had to call dealers, called over 60 dealers, distributors, and retailers in the continental United States. And from them and from our own, import research, figured at, on average, between 2024 and 2025, the United States was absorbing about 44,000 of these light electric motorcycles per year. And more interestingly, we were able to figure out who's buying them. Now, most of the time, they're being bought by millennials and boomers and Xers, people who are, let's say, 45 and above, but they're not the user. They're being purchased by older people for their niece, nephew, mostly nephew, or their sons. And so based on the dealers, distributors we spoke to, people coming in for spare parts, for tires, for repair work, the average age was somewhere around 19.
So these are the actual users around 19.
The actual users are 19. So the interesting point of the report is to kind of counteract against this narrative that, Gen Z are not interested in motorcycling. They are. They're just not interested in going to a motorcycle dealership. They're not interested in traditional brands for the most part. Certainly not the big legacy OEMs. And as a consequence, and also they're not shopping because they're shopping in different media. They're getting their information from TikTok. They're getting their information from other forms of social media, which is not where typically American motorcycle or business media go to see and test and feel the market. So to put that volume into context, like 40,000, 44,000, it's about 10% of the registered motorcycles purchased in 2025, which was 470,000. So, you have a market that's slipping, according to the members of the Motorcycle Industry Council, slipping in all categories. So if I look at it here, pardon me, everything is down. Dual sport, which is important for our discussion on ADV rider, because the MIC categorizes things as scooter, on highway, which they mean everything that's roadworthy. Dual sport, which they don't specify where dual sport ends and adventure begins. And then off-road. The off-road has done the best, is more or less flat. On highway, 7% down. Dual sport down almost 10.5%. And overall, U.S. market is shrunk by 7.5%. So if we look at those facts, those Motorcycle Industry Council numbers, and then you add a hidden 10%, which are all off-road, then the off-road market is basically the best, strongest market in the industry. And that goes against everything that we're seeing in media. That goes against everything we're reading in power sports business news and things that are being reported on. And I think it's a huge opportunity for anybody that's interested in moving the needle on motorcycles in the US.
Now, when you say off-road, is that just strictly anything that can't be licensed for use on the road?
Yes, it means a motorcycle, so not an electric bicycle, not an e-bike, but power two-wheeler with no pedals, with greater than 5 horsepower, that is not street legal. Now some of these Suron, Talaria, Neo type products do come with license plates, mirrors, and paperwork to be road registered. It's a small percentage. Like, again, we don't have absolute concrete figures, but because they're not reflected into the U.S. Department of Transportation, it suggests that it's like 1 or 2%. The vast majority of them are, and the ones you see riding on your streets in your community, and in southwestern United States, Arizona, New Mexico, California, also in Texas and Florida, these things are everywhere. But we see them in northern states, Pennsylvania, New York State, where people are riding them. These young people are riding them on the street. They're going to school. They're commuting on them. It's illegal for these vehicles to be on the street at the speeds they're being used, because they're too powerful to be classified as bicycles. So they're not. But they don't have insurance or license or often, DOT lighting. But the reality is that law enforcement, it's kind of hazy. Most law enforcement don't recognize it. They look small. They look like e-bikes. As long as they're kind of out of the way, it looks like for the most part, law enforcement's kind of not pursuing it. Other than the state of California, which is now late last year, passed legislation to trying to regulate these things in some manner. But I think that's a secondary conversation. I think what's interesting is that there is a thirst, there is a real hunger among a not small, like a pretty significant number of young Americans who are attracted to power two-wheeler in their life. And these drop shipped Chinese, high quality. Some of them are very high quality. Some of them are terrible. 4, 10, 15 horsepower electric dirt bikes is really meeting a need.
What is that need? And here's something that I don't understand. Is it strictly that they want transportation and they don't want to pay for license and registration and insurance, all that sort of stuff? Is it a way to bypass that whole industry? Because we know how crippling insurance can be cost-wise, especially when you're young. Or is the off-road component significant, or is it kind of off-road in quotation marks, i.e. we can skirt the laws of the land? How does that shake down?
I believe it's a combination. I think it's all of those things. So absolutely, the fact that it's informal, You can go on Amazon right now, or Alibaba, and have this, for between $2,500 and $4,500 US, have this motorcycle delivered to your front door, to your dorm room, to your condo, to your parents' basement, whatever. You pull it out of the box, you plug it in, some very basic things, and within 45 minutes, you're on the road. That's pretty convenient, because let's be honest, it's been said on this show a couple of times, the motorcycle retail experience is awful. It's terrible. Motorcycle dealerships in the US, it's not like in most of the world, where in any community of any size, you go to your local motorcycle shop and it's a mom and pop, and it's the scale and the localization of it makes it fairly normal practice. It's like buying any other consumer good. Here, it's gate kept. I mean, the very term power sport, power and sports, those are intimidating things. This is not inviting a 17, 18, 16-year-old in that's curious and wants to ride, but is a little bit like, well, gee, I don't want to get killed. I've heard all the stories about, murder cycle and donor cycle, and you have to go out to the middle of nowhere, because these dealers are always a big box store somewhere. So you got to hitch a ride. And then you get there, and then you get it promptly ignored by the sales staff. So these vehicles being easy to examine online, and that's where young people are. They're on their phone. And on their phone, they can watch reviews on TikTok, on socials, and figure out which model they want, order it, it gets delivered to them. It saves them having to confront the dealer who's going to ask them questions. On the license insurance side, for sure, I don't think it's that different than the way boomers in the US got introduced to motorcycling. And again, you and I have talked about this, like 1960s, early 70s. The strict letter of the law, these bikes were licensed, but most people got their first motorcycle experiences on a quiet cul-de-sac, or a neighborhood street, where they probably rode without a license, without insurance, their older sibling or neighbor's bike, and probably did that for a while before they made the decision, do I want to do this more or less?
Yeah.
And then the last point, being about sort of the off-road aspect, I think that's entirely corollary. I don't believe, based on the research we've done, that most of these vehicles are being used off-road any more than most SUVs or 4x4s, trucks are used off-road. There's a image that goes with it that suggests durability, and that makes it kind of cool. Whereas if the form factor of these bikes were really soft and like cute, or just mini motorcycle, I think it would be ridiculed, particularly where we find pop culture right now as it pertains to young men. I think the majority of young American men, 16 to 25, find their culture in an unforgiving place for anything that could be perceived as wimpy or effeminate. So the fact that it doesn't have a gearbox and doesn't make noise, if it looked like a cafe racer but was silent, there'd be judgment. And shame and judgment are, has to be said, a huge part of the motorcycle cultural experience. And I don't say that to highlight it as a positive. I think it's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that these things are styled to look like the most insane off-road mountain bike you've ever seen, except it's got 10 horsepower, kind of gives it some kudos, some credibility, that makes it feel tough and makes it feel like
extreme.
Yeah, just makes it socially acceptable.
Well, this begs the question: why are not traditional manufacturers, traditional in the sense of the motorcycle brands we know, Honda, Yamaha, etc., Why are they not in this space, as people say these days? Because they certainly have the capabilities of doing it. Most of them have sold electric mountain bikes, although that's kind of died off. So how come they're not into the same area that Ceron is and its competitors?
It's a very good question. I mean, price is a big part of it. The legacy OEM's first attempt at mainstream electrification has been very poor. The KTM Freeride, I mean, our local dealer here was giving them away, and that's before the KTM bankruptcy. Like 2 years ago, those things were nailed to showroom floors. Was the Freeride a bad electric motorcycle? Sort of. They
Was it bad? Was it bad, or was it just early?
No, it was bad because at the same time that you could get that outrageously overpriced vehicle, or a Kawasaki, whatever they call it, EX1, their electric motorcycle. Another dealer here in Eastern Canada is selling them at 50% off. They are giving them away at a tremendous loss just to get them out the door. Were these motorcycles bad as in unreliable? No, but they were bad as in they were poorly designed. I don't mean styling, although that can be critiqued as well. I mean the mission. What were these bikes meant to do? And my professional opinion is that they were meant to check a box for a large conglomerate to say, we're leading the charge on electrification. And I've been in these programs at big OEMs where they carve out unfortunate people that are inside the company and told, you're going to do this cutting edge thing. And they get really excited. And these are talented people, engineers, technologists, designers, but you're really signing up for a suicide mission because your reputation is going to be tied to that piece of junk for a good 5 years. Like, these bikes were not competitive, is the point, on weight, power, innovation. The stuff coming out of China, and I cannot overstate this. I said this on the episode about Milan. Whatever you think if you're listening in from the United States or Canada or maybe to a lesser degree Australia, what you think about Chinese motorcycles, throw that out. They are some of the best products made right now in terms of engineering and quality. And the Chinese electric bikes are really amazing. And I'm not talking the junk that's being resold as a white label by some local under a sticker that they just invented and that's going to catch fire in your garage when it's charging. I'm talking the stuff made by tier 1 Chinese manufacturers like Yadea or NIU. These products are super well made, super well engineered. They last long, and they got cutting edge software. They've got cutting edge, batteries and battery management systems that, to answer your question, that where are the Japanese? They're dragging their feet. I don't know why they're not in this market. I suspect they will be. But I don't know if they can compete on price. And an interesting piece of news that's very fresh as we listen to this, we record this in second week of February 2026. Talaria lost a lawsuit brought on them by Suron. So Chinese company suing another Chinese company over copying. So this is where we're at.
Oh, that's interesting. Is there a precedent for that? I've never heard anything like this.
First time.
Wow.
Because look, the Chinese, yes, they copy. This is not a controversial statement. When I was at Yamaha, the Majesty 250 scooter, the joint venture partner in China that partnered with Yamaha to make it in China for Chinese production, copied it and sold the exact same scooter under their own label. And then we're shocked and amazed that Yamaha in Japan was like upset by this, and it went through the court system and Yamaha won, but it doesn't matter. At that point, the damage is done. And 7 years and however much legal costs later. So the Western approach was, well, we'll out innovate China. Well, that's no longer the case. China is out innovating us by a pretty wide margin in most automotive areas. So it's interesting that tier one Chinese brands are now protecting their IP, their designs and their patents against Chinese copies. And this is in line, and give me a moment to explain to listeners, kind of what's going on inside China. The Chinese government subsidizes industry heavily. I mean, heavily. But they don't do it without a plan. And the plan is not, well, we're just going to write checks and support these companies forever. They have these 5-year plans. And, they've been very public about this. This is not a secret that they're going to cut off a lot of these auto and motorcycle companies pretty soon, because there are over, 500 Chinese motorcycle manufacturers and, a couple of dozen automobile makers, a couple of dozen more that sort of are car makers, but they're really just assemblers. But the point is, think about that in the context of the United States or, another major, Germany or something. Like Germany has like 4 major automakers, and you're like, wow, that's a lot for a small country. Now imagine if you had 40 or 400. So the Chinese government recognizes that that's unsustainable. And they're forcing consolidation. And one of the ways they're forcing that is they're, letting the cream rise to the top, the strong to take market share and expand internationally with Chinese government support. But then there's also this kind of, we're going to stop supporting these local smaller tier 2, tier 3 brands that can't, you start turning a profit and stand on your own 2 feet, or we're cutting you out, or we're going to force you to merge with someone. So this news that Talaria was sued and successfully by Suron is a big deal, and I think it's healthy, and it should be more than anything a sign to anyone listening that China is maturing. It is mature as an auto motorcycle maker. If you have any doubts about the CF Moto you've been circling at the local dealer, don't have those doubts. I'm not telling you to go buy it. I'm not cheerleading for China. I'm cheerleading for consumers having great choice right now in the market. And going back to our earlier point about young riders don't care. Young Americans don't care that it's made in China.
Right.
And that's true about most of the things they're consuming. Whether it's electronics or clothing, Shein, fast fashion, one of the fastest growing apparel brands in the world, it's all made in China. We have to face the market where it is. Young people are interested in motorcycling. They're just not interested in the motorcycles that you're interested in if you're, 45 or 50 and up.
The cars you'll find on eBay are just different. They come with a story that you can't wait to share. Maybe it's the car's history or the story of how you found it. Like this 1973 Dodge Charger on eBay that had been tucked away in an Arizona barn for over 40 years, only 55,000 miles, and somehow in great running order. It even has a rare sunroof. Suddenly, a car that was hidden for decades is uncovered on eBay and ready to be delivered straight to your driveway, thanks to eBay's Secure Purchase, the new seamless and secure way to buy your next car. In just a few clicks, the title and DMV paperwork is all handled for you. There are thousands of cars like this on eBay, from rare finds like the Pontiac Grand Prix SJ to unique builds to your next daily driver. And now, a seamless way to buy them. eBay. Things people love. The Lowdown Show is presented by ADVrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. Well, let's talk about adventure bikes. And you have some, unsurprisingly, you have some feelings about adventure bikes and where the market exists. Because, of course, every market, it rises and falls and maybe rises and falls again. But we tend to only see where we are at the moment as enthusiasts. But you obviously, your company, Motorcycle Global, you get paid to look beyond today. So what have you found? Where do you think we are right now?
I think we're at peak adventure bike. I think we've passed the peak, to be honest. If you walked around EICMA as I did for a week, it is still the dominant archetype. High handlebars, long travel suspension, big knobbly tires. Even when motorcycles and scooters absolutely were not designed for off-road use, real world use, the aesthetic, the vibe of, everything is an SUV on two wheels is certainly there. But the reason, what makes me, it's not just an opinion. I mean, sure, it's an opinion, but it's backed up by what I'm seeing in the data. Fastest growing market in the world right now is Latin America for motorcycles, in terms of change, in terms of the annual growth rate. And what people are getting excited about are what we used to just call standards. And it doesn't mean retro. Some are. But it just means, a motorcycle without a body of any kind, a headlight, maybe it has a shroud or a bezel, depending on whether it's modern and futuristic or whether it's kind of classical styling. But, a tank, a seat, some side panels and fenders, and that's it. And we're seeing that repeated in the Middle East and in Africa. Africa is a market that's often overlooked. Nigeria is a huge explosive growth. Kenya, countries, big populations, big economic development, and they're buying modern Chinese, mostly Chinese and Indian, naked motorcycles. Some are modern, some are retro, but they're not interested in dual sport. And you go, well, if you live in Colombia, in a village in Colombia, or in rural Mexico, or in a suburb of Lagos, surely you'd want that. The logic would be, oh, I want the wide handlebar and the long travel suspension. No, they want road going transport. They want to save money on fuel, and they want to be able to carry people. And in most of the world, people are more comfortable if they can put their feet down, and the high seat height, high ground clearance is of no use to them.
I've always wondered, sorry to jump in, but I've
No.
always wondered about the whole high seat height thing. And, as a 6-footer with a glorious inseam, it's never been a problem for me, but, most people, it's a real concern. And very few adventure bikes, offer any sort of reasonable seat height, do they?
Well, that's it. And I'm working on coincidentally, I'm working on a project for a very demanding customer that demands high ground clearance and a low seat height together, which is kind of an oxymoron, right? Where do we put the guts of the motorcycle? And this is not a customer in the Far East in Asia. This is a customer in the Northern Hemisphere, where people are, to use it, they're mostly of European descent. Nonetheless, they're saying our users are overwhelmingly new to motorcycling. They're being trained to do a job, and that job is not riding this vehicle. This vehicle, therefore, has to be easy to use. They need to have their butt in the seat, and their feet have to touch the ground. And some of their users are going to be 5'6". Understood. And that's where, you got to back up a bit. The next part is theory. I've been expounding facts about observational facts that we cover because I travel a lot and I study this for customers. But now what I'm going to talk about is my theory as to why adventure bikes got so big.
Now, do you mean big in every sense?
In every sense.
Or popular?
Popular. I believe that the adventure motorcycle was a reaction to 25 years of cruisers and sport bikes. In the European context, everything was a sport bike. Even the things that weren't sport bikes were sport bikes. What do I mean? The culture, the domination in the discussion, in the bike shop, in the motorcycle magazines of road racing, Grand Prix, MotoGP in the day, of GSXRs and R1s, and was so overwhelming that when I joined the motorcycle industry as a professional in 1998, 99, everything was styled to be sporty. From the most plebeian Aprilia Sonic scooter. This was an ugly, low speed, 50cc two-stroke moped for commuters, for grandmas to go get, bread at the bakery. But it was styled like some kind of Jetsons, like super bike thing. It was completely inappropriate. And that kind of approach touched every genre. Naked bikes that were perfectly happy with the round bezel headlight and the peanut tank suddenly adopted these high tail, pointy tail styling and splash graphics, and everything had to be a sport bike, even when it wasn't. In the US context, everything became a cruiser. This starts in the late 70s and 80s when standards started to have the custom look with the stepped seat and the sissy bar and the sort of higher chrome handlebar. And, why? Because it's fashion. Because suddenly, the Easy Rider look became this thing. And so even where it wasn't appropriate, these two genres for 20, 25 years overwhelmed the market to the point where the, Goldwing, which starts life as just as a naked motorcycle with a big fuel tank and designed for long range, evolves into this pseudo cruiser. It definitely has cruiser influence, bagger influence, as it evolves to the second, third, fourth generations, because it's feeding this image in the mind of the American consumer that what is motorcycle? It's a Harley-Davidson. And in Europe, what is motorcycle? It's a Ducati 916, or Japanese equivalent. Both of those archetypes are grossly uncomfortable. And like anything that dominates a space for a long enough time, eventually people just get sick of it.
So this is a case of the pendulum swings
swinging
one way and equally far the other way.
Yeah, and so the
ADV
adventure motorcycle, let's be honest, the ergonomics are pretty, if you can stomach the high seat height. But once you're sitting on that adventure bike with the wide motocross handlebar and the foot forward controls, that's pretty nice.
It's like a stand-up drafting table.
It's like you're sitting on a really comfy stool, and the controls are really light because you have so much leverage. The suspension is soft and squishy. There's a lot of sidewall, and if you go over a bad road, and let's be honest, all over the world, even in the developed world, we have bad roads, and or you make a mistake and you hit a curb, you're fine. And then added to that, it coincides with the rise of the SUV. It coincides with this adventure man, kind of aesthetic that evolves. A return to sort of the military aesthetic, probably not a little influenced by the West's involvement in Iraq and, for 20 years in Afghanistan. Yeah. So I think there is this, these things take on a life of their own. Nobody questioned in 1995 that motorcycle in America was a cruiser, a chopper, something long and raked out and made a lot of noise. And nobody today questions that a motorcycle is, this thing that's supposed to theoretically, take me and my hard luggage to the Tierra del Fuego and at the bottom of South America. But these things aren't cast in stone. They're not rational. And I think there's deep fatigue. That's the sense I got talking to not customers, but to marketers. The marketing community that I talked to in the last 6 weeks are telling me they're just out of ideas on how to sell another dual sport adventure motorcycle. How many more times are we going to see an image of someone in an impossibly beautiful remote location with their Tiger GS, take your pick. And it speaks to me that they're under pressure from the manufacturers that hired them to shift metal. and that the suction sound of the market going, yes, more, give us more adventure bikes, is starting to wane, because they're now having to push. Rather than it being sucked, it's now being pushed. So that's my ear to the ground. I hear a lot of pushback from marketers at OEMs and at agencies. And there's just not a lot of excitement in that sector. So I think coinciding with what looks like there's going to be a recession, these are very expensive machines, very single purpose. So I suspect we've gone past peak adventure bike.
I spent some time in the KTM, what's the big one, 1290 Adventure.
Yeah.
And, and I'm a fairly big guy, and I'm lots of experience as a motorcyclist, certainly no expert off-road, but it was a lot to handle, and the thing that I think that we forget is, motorcycling is also pushing your bike in and out of the shed and turning it around in the garage or your driveway or the basement of your condo or whatever you do. And I think that the latest big adventure bikes have just, I think the big adventure bike should have ended with the 950 and 990 KTM, that size. That was, I think that should have been peak big. And I think we've gone into spaceship category now, especially with the 1300 Adventure GSA BMW, which is a bizarre looking vehicle to me.
Every genre does this. The last sport bikes of the super bike era, 2014, 2016, they were completely lost. The fuck were they? Sorry for the language, but even now, I would say it's even worse. Yamaha hasn't updated the R1 in 10 years.
Yeah,
that should tell you everything. Kawasaki is doing its best to channel some kind of elementary school Japanese manga monster comic into a sport motorcycle. I mean, they're technologically masterful, but they look. The only thing they can do is shout at you about all their angled green plastic. So we see this in sport bikes. We saw it in cruisers. When did we get the most outrageous cruisers? Was at the end, when and which is presently, Grand Prix bagger bike with Öhlins TTX forks, Indians the new owners, so proud of the new Chief, which is like a replica of a 1940s motorcycle that was not popular when it was new. It's the extremes are left. And the reason being that the mainstream version of those archetypes are just not moving in the volumes that they used to. And so manufacturers panic.
You have to start yelling louder, don't you?
You start yelling louder. And the products that people still have affinity for, I remain convinced. I mean, the evidence is that the Chinese are making essentially a 1200 Sportster, Harley-Davidson clone, better made than the Harley-Davidson, but that's beside the point. People want that close, finned, air-cooled V-twin experience, but Harley doesn't. The evidence in front of them is our sales are shrinking. We'll have to make more niche models. Mm-hmm. And those niche models will command these premium prices. So we'll, preserve and protect our profit margin. It's a game of diminishing returns. You can do it for a season or two until eventually, those niche products, very small volume. The kind of person who wants that gets it, has it for a few years, moves on, sells it, whatever, and then they're not coming back for more. So this comes back to the point I made about the younger rider, the Gen Z. They're brand agnostic. They absolutely do not care that this is a homage to the 1956 whatever that won this prestigious event. They just don't care.
Well, it's too far gone.
It's too far gone. I mean, look, To me, anything before 19, like me personally, not professionally, but to me personally, my cultural consciousness starts in like 1980 when I was 5. I know what happened before then because I read and I heard from my older brother and friends, and
you were gonna say me, weren't you?
I was gonna say you, yes. But the reality is, in my lived experience, is when does music start for me? Michael Jackson, Thriller, because that's how we are. We're geared towards our era, our time,
and everything, everything before we're 5 or 10 years old exists roughly around the time of Stonehenge.
Yes, dinosaurs, and that's the thing. And so for me, it's hard. What makes it difficult for me as a professional, coming back to particularly the U.S. motorcycle market, which is a particular fixation for Motorcycle Global because that's where we bake our bread. Is there a lot of smart people in the U.S. operating in what they would call the power sports sector? They're mostly my age or older. They should know this, and they should recognize these biases. But it's not an accident that Polaris Industries unloaded Indian. It was an unhappy experiment, just as Victory Motorcycles was before it. The Polaris group did not make a lot of money on their motorcycle endeavors. Net, they lost money. Over 30 years of losing money. That's not good business.
Is it safe to say, maybe we'll do a separate one on Polaris and their motorcycle things, but is it safe to say that the financially, or is this over? No, and I'm not trying to be dramatic here, but would you say that it was a disaster, their experience with motorcycles, or am I being too bombastic?
No, I don't think it's bombastic. I mean, different lenses, right? You're a business, you're Polaris Industries, you're in it to make money, one way or the other. So Victory was profitable, I think, 4 years out of the 18 that it was in operation. So that's not good, because it's not just that they were profitable those 4 years. You got to put in the capex, the capital expenditures to develop engines and then marketing. So the net is that Victory was a gaping hole financially. So from a cash point of view, and the same can be said for Indian. So from a profitability to the group point of view, 100% did not make money. But sometimes businesses will have a loss leader, because they'll say, well, maybe we lose money on this, but it elevates the group. It elevates our prestige. It brings people in the door so that they buy these other products or services that we make. I'm not sure that Polaris can say that 35 years of trying to make an American alternative to Harley-Davidson via the Victory brand or the Indian brand did anything to sell Polaris RZR side-by-sides or snowmobiles when they made them, or watercraft when they made them. Like, I just don't think that makes sense. I worked in and I hate this phrase, power sports industry for a major competitor of Polaris, Bombardier in Quebec. And they made, point for point, same vehicles, side-by-sides, ATVs, snowmobiles, watercraft. And, those are very different clients, very different customers. The person who buys a side-by-side is probably not going to be buying a $25,000 motorcycle. They're in the dirt, they're rural, that's their lifestyle. It's very different. Same as the watercraft crowd. Those are coastal, big cities, suburbanites, very different again. Outboard, another different, so
what about from sort of jump in, but what about from an investor point of view? If you weren't going to invest in the stock market and invest in Polaris because it's a public company, does the idea that they had Victory, or particularly Indian, would that burnish their reputation?
So, this is not investment advice, but I mean, I've heard this my whole career. Why did Mercedes-Benz briefly try and own MV Agusta? Made no sense. They made a small acquisition. They were going to take over under the AMG rubric, and then Volkswagen swoops in and takes it, and it becomes, or did I get that right? No, that's what it was. And then Volkswagen got pissed off, and that's why they got Ducati. Why does Volkswagen own Ducati? It's pointless. Like, Volkswagen Group is the second largest automaker in the world. They're worth staggering amounts of money. Ducati is self-sustaining at the moment, fortunately for us as motorcyclists, whether you like their bikes or not. But it's a lot of overhead. And the reality is that, Ferdinand Piech, who was the CEO of the Volkswagen Group, was just mad about motorcycles, in particular Italian motorcycles, and he was angry that he couldn't get MV. So it was the theory being that the group was going to be, as you say, burnished. I'm sure the Indian motorcycles, because the way story was spun, were trotted out onto special events held for key investors, and that they were given away to directors and stuff of the board. Did it actually help the conglomerate? I doubt it. In the end, and this is something I've heard from people who are much more expert in finance than I am, that is to say, I'm not an expert at all, that conglomerate corporations are generally valued by the weakest division in the group. So it's actually in their interest to shed the weak group, to keep only, like, this is the elastic. Like, at one point, General Motors, was buying up everything in the 80s and trying to be all things to all people. And then at some point realized, that this is making us worse, not better. They cut it all down and went back to just cars and trucks, So I think Polaris board finally just looked at this and said, why are we in this business? If it made sense for them to keep it, they'd have kept it.
Harley-Davidson's 2025 results have been announced, and you've had a chance to look them over, and I suspect you may have a few opinions on this.
Well, let's leave the opinions aside for a moment and just look at the facts. Motorcycle sales are down 12% for the year. Debt is still high. Inventory is still high. The profit is essentially non-existent. So it's not good. They sold, according to this filing, they sold 124,000 vehicles. It was not a couple of years ago that they were touching on 200,000 vehicles. So they've fallen a lot. They still have 40,000 unsold new motorcycles in dealers. 40,000.
Wow.
Put that in context. Ducati sells about 45,000 bikes a year, total, all models. So they have to do discounts. They have to do crazy cheap financing. And this was the first, annual report with their new CEO, Artie Stars. And
2 R's.
Yes.
2 R's and stars.
And there wasn't the usual puffery. So the good news. The good news is, for as long as I've been reading Harley-Davidson investor relations documents and sitting in on those calls, bad news was always someone else's fault. Market headwinds, in air quotes, and the
God damn those headwinds.
It's always some other bullshit. It's never our products are not capable of defending themselves in the public market. This time, none of that language was present. It was actually pretty direct about how serious the situation is, talking about a turnaround, which they've been talking about for 10 years. I'm just going to focus on the numbers. Like, irrespective of the fact that they're not profitable, they're not able to make money selling hardware. They make money by selling debt, by financing motorcycles. but even that is down like double digits. I mean, 124,000 bikes minus the 40,000 in dealer showrooms means that, really the real net is they're selling under 100,000 vehicles a year. BMW in the same time last year sold 202,000. Royal Enfield sold 1.2 million. So the argument that there's no market for expensive motorcycles in the US, and we are talking the US because Harley-Davidson sales internationally have disappeared. It's a handful of thousand. It's nothing. It's trivial.
So is that down? Is that down significantly, or has it always been?
No. I mean, it was never enormous, but it used to make up about 25% of their global sales.
Oh, so significant. Can we take this? Can we chalk this up to the current president and his ambivalence about the rest of the world?
That doesn't help. Look, I've said it many times. It's product market fit. You wrap yourself in the flag, then you live by the flag. It was probably pretty hard to sell a Mercedes-Benz, or a Honda or a Toyota in, the United States in 1947, I'm guessing. If you've just been a demobilized soldier and you've come back from the Pacific or from the European theater and half your high school graduating class died, you're probably not likely to buy a German or a Japanese product. It would be even harder if the governments of those countries were then being obnoxious and in your face constantly. So, that doesn't help. Tariffs don't help. And the EU and Canada and a lot of other jurisdictions have placed very steep tariffs on Harley-Davidson products. There's actually a page in their report highlighting that. But the tariffs are reciprocal because the United States did it first. So I go back to the point that BMW sold 200,000 motorcycles in 2025. Half of them were sold in the United States, and the current American administration put a 25% tariff on imported motorcycles. So I don't know. Americans seem to be happy to buy expensive motorcycles, just not ones made in the US. And there's nothing political there. People just don't want the product. The number of people who want those products is shrinking. And, I'll maybe bring it back to where we started this conversation. Talking about, in our research, what kind of bikes are Gen Z buying? What were the friction points that they were trying to overcome? They want to be independent. Another word for independence is freedom, which might resonate with the Harley-Davidson crowd. And freedom for them means not being indentured to a giant monthly payment. It means not having to go to a hostile dealer environment. And it is a hostile dealer environment. A hostile culture. You aren't a real biker unless you're doing this, wearing that, riding this way, riding this specific kind of machine. Here's the anonymity of ordering something online and it's showing up at your door. Gen Z are also really not into the whole combustion thing. It's not that they're not good with their hands. They're, the same people who argue that, kids these days don't want to do anything. Well, I don't know. They're pretty good at putting together, like, editing videos and figuring out complex software and, teaching themselves how to ride an electric dirt bike. That's pretty impressive. Versus there's just as many of those as there are, older guys buying a Harley and fiddling with their carburetor, but who can't figure out how to make their printer work. So 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Yeah, I agree.
So so every accusation is a confession. I see a lot of parallels, frankly, between 1965 to 70, America that suddenly discovered cheap Japanese motorcycles, many of which were not very well made, many of which were, fly-by-night companies, some of which, as we know, stuck around from good brands, many of which were ridden probably illicitly without proper training and insurance or helmets and stuff like that. This is the mirror. This is the mirror in the present day. And, I think, the adventure motorcycle has dug itself a grave by being far too focused on this, dream performance scope scale, creeping like the sport bike and the cruiser did before that into a niche of a niche where it's less unobtainium. And then, the brands that operated in it, like KTM, completely imploded. I mean, KTM exists, but their sales figures were a joke this year. Like they were boutique figures, as they're just clearing out inventory and figuring out what's next. Indian was sold, but let's call it what it is. The brand is dead. They're going to restructure. They're going to make much fewer bikes, and it's going to be a boutique luxury good for a small number of people who even know or care what that is.
Do you know Indian's sales numbers?
I don't have them up right here. I do have them until 2024, I believe.
Right.
But they were flat. They kind of peaked at around, also around 40,000. The number 37 sits in my head, but don't quote me on that. I'd have to look it up.
Right.
But they're going to dwindle down because there are just not a lot of people who are going to buy an Indian Chief. And nobody outside the United States is.
No.
And that's really the tragedy, They didn't make a product that has appeal beyond a very, very narrow band of consumers.
Well, next time, let's just talk about happy things like ice cream.
Americans make great ice cream.
Oh, very excellent. Excellent ice cream. Michael, thank you again.
Always a pleasure.
This message comes from eBay. The worst part about loving cars might just be buying them and all the parts. From Toyotas to Aston Martins, eBay has thousands of cars and the largest online selection of vehicle parts and accessories. eBay, things people love. Welcome to the product review section of the radio show. This week, I'm going to talk about something a little bit unusual. It's not a tangible thing. You can't lick it. But it's the ridelikeachampion.com riding schools. Now, this is the Yamaha Champions School. Their figurehead, I'll appreciate that. Nick Einach, road racer in the 90s, used to run Sport Rider magazine, worked at the Spencer School as one of his instructors, and then he struck out on his own. So it's the Yamaha Champion School, and they have a whole bunch of online courses. And they range from beginner course, which is $30, called Beyond the Parking Lot, to other courses, including Champ Body, for those of you who want to look good in a bikini, to traffic survival and a track day course, and a core curriculum, which is probably what most of us will benefit most from. And these courses are really brilliant. And to go to the Yamaha Champion School is very expensive because they have to rent tracks and instructors and motorcycles, and it's beyond what a lot of us can afford. But this is a really great way to get your mind into riding before we hit the road this spring. And just as an aside, I'm often shocked at how poorly we prepare for the springtime riding, and I certainly include myself. And, you wouldn't grab a violin and do a recital in front of a hall full of people without practicing for 6 months. And yet we as motorcyclists get on our motorcycle and tear off every spring with very little thought about what we're doing or how to do it safely. And motorcycling, as our mothers told us, is dangerous. So we should be better prepared. And I've done one of the courses, and it's really, really useful because there's enough videos, there's enough information, and you have to pass a test to go to the next stage, which is irritating, but it's wise, because we just skim otherwise. But there's so many different things within the courses that allow you to get your mind to the point where when you go riding again, you start to be aware of things in a manner that is really useful. And it's hard to talk about online courses by just yakking about them. And I could take you through the minutiae, but I would bore you to tears. But I would encourage any of you to go to ridelikeachampion.com and check out some of the courses. And they're really well put together. They're extensive and they're not expensive. Ridelikeachampion.com. The cars you'll find in eBay are just different. They come with a story that you can't wait to share. Like this 1973 Dodge Charger on eBay that had been tucked away in an Arizona barn for over 40 years. Only 55,000 miles. And somehow in great running order. It even has a rare sunroof. Suddenly, a car that was hidden for decades is being delivered in just a few clicks with eBay's secure purchase. All the paperwork handled. There are thousands of cars on eBay, from unique finds, like the Pontiac Grand Prix SJ, to daily drivers. And now, with a new way to buy them. eBay. Things people love. Thank you for listening to the Lowdown Radio Show.